and welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You? Thank you very much indeed for joining us again. Welcome to our YouTube viewers. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And please, everybody, think about making a charity donation in place of registration fee. We support NHS Charities Together and Shelter. But if you'd rather donate to a charity of your choice, please do feel free to do so. Now, our very special guest this week is Crispin Truman, the Chief Executive of CPRE, the Campaign to Protect Rural England, as well as somebody who's achieved many other remarkable things, about which we'll hear more later from Paul, who will be leading our discussion with Crispin in the second half of the show. Crispin, hello. Can you tell us where you're calling from and what are you drinking this evening, if anything?
Good evening, Charlie. I'm calling from the CPRE's national office in London, just by the Tate Modern. So there's just a small number of us in here, but I cycled in today. And I'm drinking, faced with a load of barristers, I won't get caught out. So I'm going to keep my wits about me. So it's herbal tea, but you'll be surprised. It's in a land securities mug. I expect to find that in the CPRE mug cupboard. There's two of them.
That's a good start. That's a very good start.
Love it, Crispin. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We're thrilled to have you on and we're looking forward to our discussion with you in the second half of the show. As I say to all of our guests, if there's anything we discuss in the first half that is of interest, please feel free to chip in, but equally no obligation. And now for the panel, few of us are out and about today. So as always, Mary, over to you. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Good evening. Good evening. I'm here in the City of London in Town Legal's offices, drinking my tea from my Town Legal mug. Thank you very much. Good evening. Lovely to have you on the show, Crispin.
And Mary, what's caught your attention in the planning news in the last few days since we last spoke?
I think it's got to be the court case, which effectively has said that when the coronavirus regulations expire on the evening of the 6th of May, there can no longer be virtual planning committee meetings. So I'm sure many of the people listening will have projects that they are hoping will get before a planning committee. So I would urge all those authorities to use their very best endeavours to ensure physical events can take place.
Hear, hear, Mary. Well said. Chris, how are you doing? You're out and about somewhere?
I am. I'm in London and I'm in my virtual inquiry. I'm with my team. They're not with me right now. And it's great. It's great to be doing that. And what's even better is this evening, we're going out for a team meal in London. I mean, put your coats on, obviously. But I've got Simon James and Roland Bolton and my junior Leanne Buckley Thompson and the clients from Inspired Villages, and we're all going out for dinner. You remember that? Yeah, I've had 2 days of landscaping, so I feel like I deserve a treat. England is the finest country in the world. We know that. I say that more now because my brother is now an Australian citizen, and I like to remind him that he's left the best country. This is wine, not from South Australia. This is wine from Kent, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So I shall be having that. And I know Sasha's got a double billing, but we could go out for a beer as well. And Mary, isn't the world just a better place all of a sudden?
Yeah, wrap up would be my advice to you tonight. But yeah.
Shareholding chat with that. I'm delighted to see that. I think you might have given me about 0.001p by buying that. What's caught your attention in the news recently?
Okay, well, friend of the show, Richard Bacon, remember, he has got a task force now looking at ways in improving the delivery of self-build. Lots of local authorities are blocking self-build registers by asking people to register, but pay £500 for doing so, and then removing everybody from the register because of data protection issues. So the government is looking at how local authorities can be prevented from trying to stop this type of housing. That's what his task force is doing.
Here. Paul, I can't see you on screen, but I'm assuming you're there somewhere.
No, Paul isn't, because Paul did do a Crispin and a Sasha and cycled to work. Paul stuck in a traffic jam.
Oh dear.
There you go then.
Different angle, same room, but different angle for you.
He's travelling home, Paul, and he's probably taken the advice of his traffic consultant, hence why he's now sitting in a traffic jam.
I feel shades of Paul on the back seat coming on.
Please God. Sash, tell us where you are and what have you been up to and what's caught your attention in the planning news?
Well, I'm in London at the moment. I have just what's caught my attention. I've been in the High Court, very interesting case dealing with consultation responses, internal consultation responses, which hopefully we'll tell everyone about next week. And also it's very, very topical because, as we'll hear again next week in the Norfolk case that came out this morning about taking into a proper consideration matters when you put a consultation response. Here is the King of the North. He's completely distracting.
Well, he might be in the back seat of a car, but he's got his backdrop on.
I'm actually in chambers, I'm happy to say, but I've done some running to have to get here. So apologies for interrupting, Sasha.
No, don't worry at all. I'm just worried that you actually should be at the Crucible at Sheffield at the moment.
Well, tell us what's caught your attention in the planning news since we all last got together.
Oh, God, you're asking me when I've just sat down after running 200 metres. Thanks, Charlie.
You can't even catch your breath.
My colleagues died yesterday. Does that help?
We'll let you catch your breath. Well, Charlie Banner here. As you see, I'm out al fresco here. I'm hoping not to have the same effect on my hair as last time I was outside presenting the show. I've glued the wig down properly today. I am in a place called Hillside. You might remember me mentioning a case called Hillside Snowdonia National Park Authority a few months ago on this show, a somewhat questionable judgment of the Court of Appeal, which may now be going to the Supreme Court. I'm now acting for Hillside Parks, and here I am in Abu Dhabi at Hillside Village. Looking forward to a site visit tomorrow, and I have my family with me, and we're going to make a nice weekend of it. We're in Snowdonia National Park. Crispin, you'll be very pleased to hear. It's a beautiful place, as you can see behind me, and I'm drinking Heineken because it was all I could find. And what caught my attention in the planning news this week? Well, I was interested to see on LinkedIn this morning that there's the latest sequel to the phosphates nitrates issue that's been affecting development in the Solent catchment area and in relation to phosphates in the Somerset levels, presenting various difficulties to development in those areas. Cornwall Council has just announced what it calls a temporary pause on development in the Camel Valley catchment area due to similar phosphate concerns. And the short-term solution probably will end up being some kind of credit system where as is established in the Solent and to a lesser degree in the Somerset levels, where developers pay farmers to take land out of agricultural use to offset the nitrate or phosphate impact of development. It does seem to me a little bit ironic that what this ends up doing is enriching the farmers whose mass use of fertilisers is responsible for the pollution problem in the first place. Surely there's a better long-term solution, maybe something we can come back to later on in the series. Now, and without further ado, Sasha, you're going to lead off on the first case with a High Court case from Paul's Turf, Manchester.
I am. I know. Absolutely. I know. Manchester City Council, Paul's tax has been going towards High Court litigation. I hope Kings pay a huge bill, frankly. So, yes, I'm dealing with an enforcement notice case, which went to the High Court last week. And basically, this involved an enforcement notice where domestic dwelling had been turned to four commercial units. And the fundamental question on the ground A, the ground A was successful. The inspector took the view that effectively, that there we see it on the screen, the inspector considered the question of the appeals. There were various technical appeals, but there was also on ground A, which fundamentally got home, and the inspector allowed the appeals and felt the premises which were in commercial use. There were 4 rooms being used, 1 as a travel agent, 2 as couriers' offices, and 1 as a therapy treatment room. And what effectively happened is the inspector granted consent, as I said, under ground A, and made an assumption effectively that he was restricting the ground A appeal to those proposed uses. And just to read it out, is that the nub of the challenge was that the inspector's intention was obviously to restrict the 4 units to those uses, but he didn't give legal effect to it because he didn't impose a condition, which of course you can do in the context of allowing a ground A under 1775, and the inspector didn't do that. So what could happen in law is obviously there could be a change of use of those various units to other uses within the same use classes, and they could also rely on the permitted development rights. So what the simple point is that the permission granted under 1775 was not what the inspector in effectively wanted to impose. And it's a very clear example. The two takeaway points are for all of those who are watching, both inspectors, and we've got some mighty inspectors watching tonight, and local authority officers working in enforcement. Do make sure you impose conditions or seek conditions in the context of enforcement notice appeals. And if you don't, there's likely to be problems, as shown in this successful 289 challenge.
Thanks, Sash. Some wise words indeed. Well, I'm going to deal with the second High Court case, which I'm interested to hear your thoughts on at the end, Sash, given what you've been doing today. So this is the case of Swanscombe Parish Council and Norfolk County Council. It's a judgment of Mrs. Justice Lang, allowing a claim for judicial review, which unusually wasn't of a local planning authority's grant of planning permission, but the local highway authority, county council's consultation response in relation to a planning application. The application was for the redevelopment of a site for agriculture-related commercial development. And one of the issues about which the parish council was concerned was traffic and access and highways considerations. The developers' proposed access arrangements were considered by the county council highway officers to be unsatisfactory. However, when voting upon what the county council's formal highways consultation response should be as statutory consultee, members of their cabinet resolved not to object on the basis that the economic impact of the proposals overcame the highway concerns. And the county council proceeded to submit a formal consultation response to the local planning authority, South Norfolk, on that basis. Now, Mrs. Justice Lang agreed with the parish council that the consultation response was unlawful and should be quashed. She thought that the proper remit of a statutory consultee's response was the basis on which they are prescribed as a statutory consultee in the first place under Schedule 4 of the Development Management Procedure Order. So for local highway authority, it was highways considerations and no other matters. And she went on to hold a proper response required of the county council in this context was an expert response in its capacity as highways authority, not its wider views and the benefits of the local economy. Therefore, the county council's consultation response was ultra vires, in other words, outside the statutory remit, and also it took into account immaterial considerations, which is another ground for being unlawful in public law. Mrs. Justice Lang rejected the county council's submission that the consultation didn't need to be JR'd or quashed on the basis there was an alternative remedy for the developer to pursue, namely to persuade the local planning authority not to follow the consultation response. In her view, she said representations by the claimant to the ALPA are no substitute for a statutory consultation response by an expert highways authority. Now, my observations on this, it's the first, Sasha, do say if you think I've missed one, given your case, but it's the first case I'm aware of which has gone to judgment where a consultation response has been quashed. And it's certainly that's an important development in the scope of JR in planning. There's been some case law in the past about statutory consultees potentially overing a private law duty of care in drafting their consultation response, breach of which could in principle be actionable in damages. The paradigm being if negligent highways advice led to a car crash or something like that. The judgment of Lord Justice Simon Brown to that effect. But to the best of my knowledge, this is the first successful judicial review of statutory consultation response. Secondly, the judgment doesn't actually consider whether a consultation response is amenable to judicial review in the first place. Judicial review normally is only available as a remedy in relation to the exercise or non-exercise of public functions that have some kind of legal consequence or effect, for example, by affecting the claimant's position in some identifiable way. And it seems to me to have been at least arguable. This isn't the case with the consultation response because a response to a consultation doesn't itself affect anyone's legal positions or rights. The decision following that response, the decision whether to grant planning permission or not, which is the decision that has legal effect. It will be. I wrote in my notes today. It'll be interesting to see if this judgment leads to developers or objectors threatening JR claims against statutory consultees, such as Highways England, Historic England, etc. Sounds like, Sasha, that might already have happened, if given what you described about your case.
My case is also of interest. It's about internal consultees
within a local authority.
Council, whenever conservation officer writes a response to assist the planning officer writes.
That's a bit different because it doesn't have the same statutory framework that there is for statutory consultation. There's a bit of an issue as well about how, to what extent, if a consultation response is jailable, that really affects sort of freedom of thought of a consultation respondee. I think there's a sort of policy issue there. Mrs. Justice Lang did go on to hold that if the County Council had wanted to make representations about the merits of the application, it could have done so, just not as a statutory consultee. It could have done so in a separate, informal political response. The distinction being that statutory consultation responses, it's clear under case law, has to be given considerable or great weight in cases such as Shadwell and Ashdown Forest, whereas a non-statutory consultee doesn't have to have great weight, and so it would be impermissible for a statutory consultation wants to go outside its remit. It'd be interesting to see how far that principle applies. For example, if Historic England was to opine on whether public benefits outweigh less than substantial harm, my view is that's not a heritage issue, that's a balance issue. Certainly if the public benefits aren't heritage matters, and you're smiling, that might be what your case is about, but public benefits is for the planners. But anyway, an important case. Well done to the claimant lawyers, because it must have been quite a bold decision to challenge that case in the first instance, given the lack of authority on the point. Even if I'm not totally sure, I would have found the same if I'd been the judge, God forbid. Now, on that note, over to Letchworth. And Mary, you're going to tell us about a crematorium decision.
Yes, indeed.
Lovely subject for a sunny afternoon.
Yes, this is a decision following a virtual public inquiry between two main parties. And the interesting twist in this one was that both of them were councils. North Herts were, in fact, the appellant promoting the development of land in the open countryside for, as Charlie says, a crematorium. And Central Beds were the planning authority resisting it on the basis that it was not an appropriate location, that it would have an adverse impact on the character and appearance of the area, and that there was no need for the proposal. And as you might expect, with a battle between two authorities, the barristers all came from Cornerstone. Martin Edwards was representing North Herts as the appellant, and Ed Grant was representing Central Beds. And there was a Rule 6 party. Here's another little interesting twist. The Rule 6 party was a crematorium operator operating a facility 3 miles away from the application, represented by Ian Ponter, ex-Cornerstone, now, of course, indeed, now in Paul's chambers.
Where?
So I've got a site plan. Rob, can we have the site plan? And just leave that there for a second, Rob. So this site was adjoining another parcel of land already in use as a crematorium. So not only did I have a crematorium 3 miles away, there was one immediately adjacent. And the expansion of that plot adjacent was described by the inspector as being several decades away, because there were 4,000 unused plots on the land to the east or the right-hand side of the red line shown on the screen. Now, you can't get this from the site plan, but the inspector thought that the new proposals, which were on a prominent site sloping away from the current site, from this current crematorium, would be much more visually intrusive and more prominent than the current operation, that there would be a significant adverse effect and on a large number of receptors, and that therefore the proposal was contrary to the local plan, it was contrary to the emerging plan, and it was contrary to the MPPF paragraph 170B. And there was no robust evidence of need, hence my point about the crematorium next door, 3 miles away, and oodles of unused plots. And there were no other advantages that the inspector could identify. For example, there wasn't any evidence to suggest that the cost of such facilities would decrease, or that there would be shorter journey times as a result of more facilities. And although there were some additional jobs, all in all, the inspector took the view that there were insufficient material considerations to outweigh a conflict of the development plan. And so the appeal was dismissed. Back to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Mary. Chris, as a rugby fan, it seemed apt to give you the Twickenham case. That's got nothing to do with the stadium.
Yes, well, I did wonder about this. I just say I'm quite interested in Mary's case and the future supply. I haven't done a 5-year supply of crematorium space yet, but yeah, I like the way that was approached as an issue. Or there'll be complaints about that, won't there? Now, as far as my case is concerned, if Rob can bring that up, I did wonder why I'd been given this case. It's 0.3 hectares in size. And it's being operated as a waste treatment site for oil in London. So about as far, Crispin, away from what you're interested in as is humanly possible. And as you can see, it's redevelopment for commercial space and 24 residential units. So what it was really about was trying to get some residential on an industrial site. Now, there's a number of interesting features about this case. The first of which is housing land supply. No, I'm kidding. There is a housing land supply aspect. I could get it in, but I'm going to leave it just for once. Okay. What happened was the redevelopment was objected to by the council, and the inspector accepted that it's not appropriate to redevelop the site because of policy SI9, which requires that when existing waste site, it's all been a baptism of fire for me, this has, but an existing waste site can only be supported where appropriate compensatory capacity is made in London for the same level in the waste hierarchy and at least meet or exceed the minimum achieved. So you have to have a compensatory measure before you can get rid of a waste facility in London. Who knew? So no compensatory measure. They couldn't provide that. They tried to suggest a Grampian condition, and the inspector said there's no certainty at all associated with that, so failed even the legal test on the Grampian condition. As far as the development plan was concerned, a breach of the development plan in terms of loss of industrial floor space. But perhaps the more interesting aspects of the case, and I'm not saying, waste isn't interesting, of course it is, but are Class E, because they ran a Class E argument about the fallback, and they said the council's concern to protect the industrial space is undermined by the permitted development rights around Class E. But what the inspector said about this, and I think this is very interesting, paragraph 57, the appellant's commercial evidence was that the sheds were no longer fit for purpose and had come to the end of their useful life. It was maintained that there's no real prospect of them being used for that purpose without physical improvement. And the inspector pointed out, well, there's no permitted development rights to allow such works. And it was a backland site with no street frontage. So he took the view it was unlikely that the Class E fallback would come into effect. So despite the permitted development rights, the inspector rejecting that as a fallback case. And the other aspect of it is an objection from Twickenham Studios, represented by the always very smooth Richard Ground. And their case was, in effect, that it would cause disturbance, noise disturbance. The inspector felt that could be addressed, but they also wanted to expand. There's limited expansion to Twickenham Studios, and the inspector thought that that would fall within the potential industrial uses. The film industry is an industry, and therefore could potentially use this site in the future. So rejected the noise argument, but accepted that. Now, Twickenham Studios, I didn't really know, but I've heard of Pinewood and some others. They've done these films there. An American Werewolf in London, isn't that a classic?
Yeah.
Blade Runner, A Fish Called Wanda, and The Italian Job. If I was at home, I'd get out my poster of The Italian Job. I appreciate I'm moving slightly off planning issues here.
Yeah.
Am I? But anyway, that's what happened. The appeal was dismissed. Twickenham Studios expansion plans to potentially continue. Residential wasn't allowed, and I didn't say anything about 5-year land supply, did I?
Cheers, Chris. You're right. Pinewood Studios, a long-time client of mine, and probably my best ever site visit, apart from this one, was going on the set of Prometheus, the Alien prequel with Kit Kat many years ago. We were the only people who got out of the alien's nest alive, apart from the hero of the film. Sorry to spoil it if you haven't already watched it. Now, over to Paul. You're going to lead our interview with Crispin, which I'm really looking forward to. So I'll leave it to you to further introduce Crispin and kick off the discussion.
Yeah, can I just flag up, Charlie? Seeing you on a weekly basis means that's now the 5th time I've heard that anecdote in a year. On your anecdotes now.
Yes.
It's really interesting while you're in Wales. Crispin, good afternoon. I'm sorry about the rather shambolic entrance into this. It's due to problems in the centre of Manchester, and my joy of being in chambers the second time only since last July, which is all a bit bizarre, really. So Crispin Truman, CPRE Chief Executive. You started off life, as did I. You're a fellow alumni of the comprehensive school system. Then you ended up in Oxbridge, although you went to the wrong one. You went to the Western one. Sorry about that. And then you ended up as a social worker in Barnet, a chief executive officer of a mental health charity. Then you were chair of the London Cycling Campaign, trustee of mental health, Rethink Mental Illness, and then this dizzying array of organisations involving heritage, the built environment, mental health, the church in the last decade, before you finally, in 2017, stepped into being chief executive of CPRE. Firstly, wow. Where on earth do you get the time and energy? It's the only other person I know who's got anything like that amount of energy is Charlie. And secondly, what was it that first attracted you to the role of CEO of CPRE?
Well, of course, I didn't do it all at once, Paul. But yeah, I mean, it is. One of you said something very nice about my career on LinkedIn. I thought, gosh, nobody ever says that, because it does look very unconnected. But to me, it all links up. I'm not someone that thinks in silos, and to me, having a good environment, a built heritage, and a natural environment is key to mental health. It all links together. But yeah, I got involved in voluntary stuff quite early on, younger than a lot of people. I think there's a big issue actually, because charities particularly need younger people on the board, because I just felt I wanted to do something. I had to do something about what I was seeing around me. So I guess cycling is a good example there, because I was cycling to work in London and finding it, what should be a normal experience, just getting to work in an efficient way, was quite daunting. I was quite badly treated by motorists on the road, and my reaction was potentially aggressive. I thought I need to channel this constructively. So instead of getting cross and having road rage, I joined the London Cycling Campaign to do something about it policy-wise. And, you know, over time in London, we've seen a big improvement. London cycling is now seen as an issue for the health and well-being of all Londoners, not just those who cycle. So, you know, you can see it all connects up. But in the end, I came to CPRE because I've been in the heritage sector at Churches Conservation Trust for 14 years, working on the built environment side. But I'd always had a personal passion for the natural environment. The chance came up. CPRE is very rooted in its local network. So it combines sort of lobbying Westminster and influencing national policy with a very local campaign set up. And that's very exciting. It's not just yet another brain system lobbying body in London, but it's something that's really connected to local people and has a real membership. And that makes a big difference to ministers. So that really attracts me. But it's also a chance to campaign. And it's an organisation that does work across sectors. So the upside is we do work across society, the built environment, natural environment. The downside is it gets quite complicated. But yeah, I love it. 3.5 years in, and there's still loads to do.
Well, it's joyous to hear anybody talk about their job with enthusiasm. So I'll dampen it, because I'll then point out that CPRE regularly intersect with the planning system, which is hence the reason why you're on. But the nature of the organisation may be a bit understood by many. So you call yourself the Countryside Charity, and yet you've adopted a strategic plan for 2020 and to 2026. How does that interact with the built environment and the objectives of the built environment, and how that interacts with the countryside?
Well, CPRE is 95 years old. If you go back to its origins, actually, it was always about the built environment and the natural environment and people's experience of it. Going back to the 1920s, it was a real fear at that point. People, in fact, soldiers coming back from the First World War who had been fighting for England's green and pleasant land, came back to find that it was all being built over and they had no access to it. So it was always about people and access and countryside and the built environment. But I guess the heritage stuff, the built environment stuff, was dealt with a lot in the 60s and 70s when there's a big battle over heritage particularly. And that was partially won, I guess. You know, St. Pancras Station wasn't demolished. And the natural environment's moved very much higher up in the agenda. But we are about the whole picture. As I said, it's a complicated one. So when I joined, we'd found that there's possibly a lack of focus, possibly we've been too much on the back foot, a lot of negative campaigning, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, and possibly an overemphasis on the wonderful planning system. So we wanted to re-gear and become much more about solutions, positive solutions for the countryside, and helping people to engage with and enjoy and therefore care for the countryside. So the planning system is brilliant. It's a brilliant tool, but we're not a planning charity, we're a countryside charity. But planning is how our local people particularly make the difference. And, it is a great democratic tool despite all its faults.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because the strategic plan itself seems to have lots of things that one might see in other organisations, such as encouraging the efficient use of land in urban and suburban areas, having a planning system which delivers the right developments in the right place, improving the experience of the countryside, etc. But you also engage in research projects as well. And I think this week we've just had one published you've just had one published in relation to AOMBs, which has the slightly leading title of Beauty Still Betrayed. So explain what you do in terms of furthering the information that's out there to inform what's called for in this document, which is changes to MPPF to further protect AOMBs.
Yeah, well, one of the great strengths of CPRE is rooted in evidence, and I think our reputation, we do get listened to, and we are sometimes seen as a sensible voice in the room, which is right. So we like to base all our campaigning on proper research and evidence, and the AOMB project is no different. We've done reports recently on transport and green belt as well. So a large part of our work, particularly at the national level, is evidence-based, building the evidence base for planning and strategic approach to land use, as you said. But we're also supporting very local campaigning by local people. And increasingly, we want to develop projects that demonstrate what good looks like. So, for example, we've just raised a load of money for hedgerow planting. Hedgerows might seem very specific to you, but actually they're a wealth of nature and biodiversity. They connect the landscapes. That's very CPRE, connecting everything up. And they're massively depleted. So we're calling actually for a huge expansion in hedgerow planting alongside, there's a lot of focus on trees at the moment. We love hedgerows as well. So our vision that you mentioned, it's about a thriving, beautiful countryside for all. And the thriving bit is about a living countryside. So we don't just work on people's access and enjoyment of the countryside, but we also work on having strong living rural communities, places where people can live and work and go to school and access services, so that, rural communities are there to look after our countryside, but we want it to be a living place as well. And finally, we do a lot of work nationally to support our local groups. So giving people a voice in what happens to the local environment is a big part of the strategy you just showed there.
Just to mention that, just to understand how it works, you said already that you're essentially a federated organisation, an umbrella organisation for about 40-odd individual CPRE groups. How does the sort of research work and policy work you're doing at a national level inform what those individual groups do?
Well, the aim is that national work creates an environment that supports their campaigning, so it becomes easier for them to have a say in their local environment, to get good outcomes for their local environment. It is federated, so like many charities in Britain, in England, we are an English charity. It's interesting, can be challenging sometimes, getting everyone to speak with one voice, but there's huge power in it. And we're a broad church, which again is challenging. People with a wide range of views, politically and otherwise. We're non-party political, but that are united by that passion and love for countryside and nature, and that is very powerful. That brings people together in that way. But yeah, federation gives you that local edge and the national voice, and that combination can be very effective.
One of the ways in which CPRE sought to intervene over the last sort of 6 months or so after the publication of the white paper, not 8-9 months ago now, was to bring together 17 different organisations as diverse as the RSPB to the Open Space Societies and the various wildlife trusts, and making representations for what was called a joint vision for planning, which is quite interesting because it talks about having a solution-focused vision, but also the planning system should be plan-led and locally led, which followed on from your representations on the white paper last November, where you were expressing serious concerns about the proposals in the white paper. So here's a free hit, Crispin. If government was able to listen to all of this information, but you could pick one thing out of the various things that you were promulgating with the 17 other organisations and your response to the white paper, what would it be?
Well, if we're talking about the current planning system, the current planning system is far from perfect. We don't question that it can be improved, and there's a lot of things that we don't improve it. But if you want to get me to focus on one, it would possibly be around land compensation and compulsory purchase to fund affordable housing. So some people think CPRE doesn't worry about housing. We worry about housing a lot, but affordable housing, particularly in rural areas, because I said we want strong rural communities. So I think something that made sure there was a a fairer share of land, the land value uplift when land is developed, and that could be used for public services, but particularly for affordable rural housing. When it comes to the proposals for change, there's a whole host, as you said. We're very proud of the coalition we brought together from NGOs from across a wide range of sectors. We've got some very specific issues around that, but one of them, perhaps the most powerful, and one that is a concern now, is support for community engagement and local scrutiny. It does feel, and I hear this again and again when I go around the country talking to our local groups, pre-COVID of course, that they're feeling disempowered, they're feeling frustrated, they're feeling increasingly excluded from the debate. So that proper community engagement to make sure that the planning system is a democratic one is got to see that in the new whatever reforms come about.
Well, like a brilliant Radio 4 continuity announcer, that leads perfectly into my next question, which is your background really interested me, particularly the work with mental health charities. And the reason I say that is because those who have input into the development management process often feel like we're polarized into one of two camps. It's developer or conservationists, whereas obviously a properly functioning planning system involves balancing factors, not choosing between one of two extremes. So you've got a much broader background than I think certainly all of us on the webinar and most people that I encounter in this job, I suspect. So what skills do you think are lacking in the planning system, and how might one better engender cooperation and compromise rather than demonizing those who take an opposing view?
Yeah, I mean, I am a generalist, but I can only do my job because I've got a fantastic professional team behind me, and that's what CPRE nationally spends its members' money on, is real expertise. We've got a great planning team who briefed me a bit on today's session, so don't worry, I know it all now. But joined up thinking is key, and I think for my sort of job, I think it does really help. And the first place to start is with government. I mean, government, and we know this so much, don't we, in every sector, just isn't joined up. So we talked to DEFRA, the Rural Affairs and Environment Department, and they've got fantastic cross-government goals around the environment. 25-year environment plan supposed to leave the environment in a better state than we found it. Obviously, the Environment Bill, which has been delayed recently, but still very hopeful of that. Great ambitions there, nature recovery networks, and yet you go and talk to the MHCLG, the planning department, and it's as though they're in a different world. There's no reference at all to environmental goals that are meant to belong to the whole government. So much more joined up government. With the planning white paper you've referenced there, one of the things we've got to see is much stronger read across government to environmental goals, because the planning system is one of the main tools for implementing environmental goals. But it's not just at government level. You're right. I think there's more room for multidisciplinary training. One of the challenges for the planning system, which I know you all know very well, is lack of capacity in local authorities and lack of expertise. It doesn't necessarily just have to be pure planning expertise. I think it is that combination of understanding of community and the natural and the built environment. So, because as you say, and we totally agree on this, the planning system should be achieving balance. We've got a small country, not enough land, we're an island. The planning system is a device that should be planning, balancing all those stakeholder interests, and meeting the needs of people, nature, and the infrastructure and housing stuff that we need. And yeah, you're right, we should all be working together. The adversarial setup that planning so often leads to, some people might say that lines the pockets of the legal system, but I wouldn't dream of saying that. But it means often that nothing gets delivered, because communities digging their heels in, setting red lines. You get the developers putting forward ridiculous top-down proposals, and everyone digs their heels in, has a big battle, and nothing gets built, and the wrong countryside gets lost. So yeah, we need much more collaboration, and I think that means strong, proper community voice with a well-resourced local authorities would make this a much more even debate, and one where you'd probably end up with more being delivered.
As well as a role for those who scrutinise it in detail, such as...
absolutely.
Right, okay, next issue then, a bit more philosophical. Are the government right in contending that there's a need to boost significantly the supply of housing? Or might one think that your organisation would prefer to promote a presumption against development of greenfield land? And if you were, how do you avoid the errors of the past of over-dense brownfield land development?
I think the problem with government housing numbers is the way it's so top-down and the way it's just numbers. So numbers of units, whatever they are, no thought about size, location, affordability, tenure, all the other things which make such a difference, design. So CPRE, we actively support the National Housing Federation and Shelter goal of 145,000 genuinely affordable houses a year. So we support significant house building to meet needs, but meeting needs is not the same as responding to the market. And for us, of course, because we want rural, our interest is in rural communities, it is about making sure a lot of those are meeting the needs of rural communities. But in terms of greenfield, we're not totally opposed to greenfield, and there are some great examples of greenfield developments. Often some of the rural housing associations like English Rural and Hasto Housing do some really great projects, quite small scale, but community-led, well-designed. But the key thing for us is develop the brownfield first. Why build on greenfield sites if there's derelict land in the town or village or empty properties? It's getting the sequence right. We need a brownfield first policy that makes sure you exhaust the supply of pre-use land before you start taking away countryside. So brownfield first, not brownfield exclusively. And we know not all brownfield is suitable, but we reckon there's over 1 million homes worth of brownfield out there that's not being used. And a lot of it's not even appearing on the register. We find when our local groups, like in Enfield recently, our local group did their own, literally walking around the borough search and found a whole load of brownfield that wasn't even on the register.
Having got from you that one can have greenfield land developed in the right place, provide the right form of development, I'll end my questions. I'll hand over. Mary, I think you have a question.
I do have a question. Rob, can I ask our IT man? You talk about evidence, Crispin. I'd like to show you a piece of evidence. Rob, you have a picture, I think, of some lovely new development in the AOMB in a place called Tetbury, which I think Chris provided you with earlier today. So there we go. Now, I'm proud to say that development was as a result of an appeal that I did, which I know caused quite a lot of anxiety at CPRE at the time, because it was a significant development on the edge of Tetbury. My question to you, having pointed to what I think is a really good scheme, using local materials, and although there aren't hedgerows there, my goodness me, there aren't the close bordered fencing that I personally have a real antipathy against. Does CPRE accept that the AOMB supports places and that young people have just as much right to work and live in those places as their parents? And do you support the principle of development in the AOMB?
Those are two very, very different questions. But we certainly support the right of young people. And AOMB is just like any other countryside to be living places, absolutely. But areas of outstanding natural beauty, like national parks, are our best countryside. They are the countryside that we as a country have decided through government are the best bits that should be enhanced and protected for future generations. So we shouldn't be building on them lightly. And we think all countryside is valuable, particularly that near where people live. But as a country, these are the places for nature that we all want. So why are we building on them if we don't have to? We actually, until 2010, we were largely happy with building in AOMBs because it generally was needs-led, small-scale stuff. And there are good examples. The Tetbury decision, I believe the problem with it was it set a precedent following the change to the MPPF in 2010 that changed the narrative so that it's seen as much more fair game, particularly for local authorities facing pressure to deliver a 5-year land supply. And that since 2010, we've seen a doubling of approvals for housing development, some quite large in AOMBs. So it is very worrying. That's why our latest report is called Beauty Still Betrayed. And it really should, if we are saying these are the best countryside, it should be the last resort to be building on them. But that doesn't mean, absolutely, if it's needs-led, well-designed, and there are South Devon AOMB is beautiful. It's only 18 houses, but it's completely supported by the local community because it's for local community use and well-sited and things. Right housing in the right place. It's been the mantra since 1926.
Thank you, Crispin.
Thanks, Crispin. Sasha, do you have a question?
Before we go any further, by the way, I've got my 8 discs to play. Who do I give them to?
If you can just put those in the post, second class, then we'll listen to them later. Thanks, Crispin. Sasha.
My question, Crispin, is that from our side of the fence, so to speak, you know almost you'll get various things with a planning application for housing. You'll get, an objection almost invariably from the CPRE. And what I'd say, potentially playing devil's advocate, is because you bark so often, it loses its velocity, because it's happening, on almost every greenfield site any of us do, there is a CPRE objection. So therefore, you can't grade the importance, so to speak. It's difficult to weigh that. Don't you think maybe more selective, so when it does bark, it bites, so to speak, on the decision maker?
Yeah, when we don't want to be in the negative no position as much as we are, but we're forced to do so because there are a lot of problematic proposals. I'm guessing, I might be wrong, but because you're barristers, doesn't that mean you only come in when there's a bit of an argument going on? So you probably aren't aware of the many cases where we don't object and where things go ahead because everyone's reasonably happy. I mean, we are a charity with very limited resources. A lot of our local groups are very small. And I'm not saying we do it right every time, and there may be times when cases are a bit vexatious, but often we don't object. And often we're not alone. In fact, I get a lot of contacts from non-CPRE groups asking us to help them, resident groups and others trying to stop big inappropriate developments in their areas and loss of green space. But we are trying to be much more about solutions. What our aim with our new strategy we were talking about earlier is to create a much louder voice for countryside. So we talk much more about the positive value of countryside for well-being. We've seen that during the lockdown, haven't we? How much people need green space near where they live. But it's also as part of the response to the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis. Countryside is the land where we put nature, and we need to look after it and enhance it. And if we can get enough people talking about that, then we think that policymakers might be less inclined to, at the moment, to easily trade off the benefits of countryside against the benefit of other social goods. So we'd rather not be objecting so much. The problem is, Sasha, our evidence is that a lot of the stuff coming forward is pretty poor. We did a housing design audit, which looked at design and sustainability, and particularly around transport connections. We did that with the UCL and the House Builders Federation just over a year ago, and it found that 75% of new developments were of poor quality according to the government's own design standards. So that's pretty poor. It got worse the more rural you got. So the rural areas are coming off worst. So that, no wonder there's a lot of objecting going on.
Chris?
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. Crispin, I've got a huge amount of respect for you personally, if I must say so. It's no good this organisation being led by somebody who hasn't seen the harder side of life in terms of the charity work you've done, the mental health charity, working with people in inner city areas. So I think, if I may say so, we should fully applaud that, as Paul did, because you have a breadth there of knowledge about other people's needs, not just from the countryside. And indeed, some people have declined to come on the show, and you've come on to the show. I described it as Country File meets Dragon's Den.
Yes. Wonder about the money, actually. You haven't mentioned that yet.
Yes. Well, you need to pitch. You need to keep pitching, and then we'll buy in. But, so enormous respect for you, okay? What I would disagree with about the housing is not just the numbers. I could tell my kids they could go to school whenever they liked, but it's probably better that I give them some certainty that it's 5 days a week, 40 weeks of the year, and 5 hours a day or 6 hours a day. You need the numbers, otherwise people would just say, well, it'll be whatever it will be, okay? So that's probably why we've got the numbers. My question, okay, having warmed you up, I often do this, is that the Church of England have recently published a report in which it estimated that 8 million people in England live in overcrowded and unaffordable homes. Millions more suffer from high rents, with one of the lowest per capita levels of housing stock in Europe. And in major cities where there's a focus on brownfield land, as you talked about, there's no net gain of affordable housing when right to buy losses are taken into account. Only 11% of the country is built upon, and that includes parks and gardens in cities. Why is it that the CPRE will not recognise that well-designed, and I do emphasise that, well-designed new development on greenfield land, delivering between 20 and 50% affordable housing, is far more important than saving some fields around the edge of settlements?
Yeah, I know the Church of England report, it was pretty good, and we do largely agree with it. It was actually very critical of the current system and also some of the Church of England's own land investments. So there was a lot of agreement with it. And as I said before, where brownfield has been exhausted and there's clear community need and it's well designed, we will support greenfield development. But if you turn that around, well, first of all, why not more affordable than 20 to 50%? The real need, you described the housing need and the lack of stock. It is affordable and social housing that the real lack of stock is. And we're just seeing so much that's built as executive homes in the middle of green spaces, car dependent. There was a Transport for New Homes research recently that found that 40% of the land for greenfield new housing developments, 40% was for cars. It was tarmacked. It wasn't housing. And that's, there's a real issue with where we're putting this stuff and the access to services and the transport around that. But we don't dispute the need for housing. As I said, we backed the 145,000 figure from NHF, and Shelter. We've worked with Shelter on this quite a lot. And although you're right, course numbers have to be part of it, but why not numbers and tenure and location and size and some of the other factors that home in on where the real need is? But if I turn that question around, even if you agree with all the government's position on housing need, we also need countryside. And we did some review. I don't know if you know, there's something called the Glover Review of National Parks and Areas of Outstanding Natural Beauty a couple of years ago, still waiting for the government response on that. But we did some research around that, found that a third of the population in this country are too far from national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty to gain reasonable access. And half of the most socially deprived areas are completely out of range of that, mostly in the Midlands, nowhere near the best countryside. So we've got to look after the other countryside too, the countryside like Greenbelt, that's near where 30 million people live. Sometimes people say it's a bit grotty. Well, let's invest in it and make it better and enhance it. And a lot of the countryside we've got, you say only 11%, but a lot of damage is not just about the actual development itself, it's the visual impact, it's the wider effect on tranquility. Not just talking about housing here, we're talking about distribution sheds and roads and all sorts of other infrastructure development that has a massive noise and visual impact as well. So you've got to look at all those things together. But in the end, we do support the right housing in the right places. So as we started out talking about, if the planning system's working, it should be balancing all these needs. But we shouldn't just be saying we need housing, therefore countryside can go. We don't trade off other social goods, do we? So we agree housing's important, but countryside's important too. You wouldn't say we need housing, so knock down a hospital to build it. So why do you say we need housing, so knock down some countryside to build it? So I think we just need a better balance. And if the planning system is providing that, I think we'd all be very much more on the same page than we are.
It's interesting. I wonder if we need a better narrative as well. What's been really interesting looking through some of the questions and comments that are coming through from the listeners is that there's a number of instances where some people are saying, why doesn't the CPRE engage more positively with local developers to bring things forward? Some people saying where there has been engagement, positive responses have happened. And Caroline Dibden, for example, points out that CPRE supported 700 homes on land east of Horndine, enhance greenfield sites in a local plan. We should see more of that, frankly, rather than object. Charlie, you've got a question.
Yes, Crispin, thanks for all that insight. I mean, you said in your discussion with Paul a few times that the planning system should be democratic, and I completely agree. But a true democracy, of course, is a system where all people's views and needs are taken into account. And I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of people think that so-called democracy in planning doesn't give a voice to those who, for example, would like to live in a particular area, maybe where they work, where their family are, but who can't afford to or can't find a home there. And against that sort of background, my question for you is this. Imagine that you were introduced to someone who is unable to afford a home in a particular local authority area where there's a housing shortfall and where brownfield isn't delivering enough affordable housing, or indeed possibly any because of viability issues, and where there's a greenfield housing development on a non-designated landscape, including 40% affordable housing, which had just been dismissed on appeal following a CPRE objection. And I say that's not a totally hypothetical situation. And dare I say, not just on design grounds, almost all these objections are on principle. How would you go about explaining to that person that the protection of the countryside was more important than giving them the opportunity to have a home of their own?
Oh, we wouldn't say it was more important. We would, if it was national park area, we would say those are the best countrysides, so it should be pretty exceptional to pull on them. But overall, we wouldn't say it's more important. We say you need to find a balance of both. Now, you said 40% affordable. Maybe the answer would be a high proportion of affordable in that development. So it depends on the particular development. Not saying we don't sometimes get it wrong, but we do support the National Housing Federation target, and we do recognise a need for housing. I mean, the point about democracy is really very true from all our points of view. And yeah, the reason CPRE is often the best is because our volunteers, our local people, are steeped in the planning system. They're expert, they're often retired planners. They're very hard-working volunteers. I go around the country, I'm amazed by what they all do. But they've had to put so much into it. Your average punter, you're right, your average concerned citizen doesn't have the time or the expertise to participate in it. You look at neighbourhood planning, which is fantastic in theory, but the amount of work volunteers have to do to produce a neighbourhood plan, only to be told, sorry, the 5-year land supply means that it has to be invalidated. That's not democratic. So you're right, and it's not just for our interests. In general, I do agree that it does need to be made more democratic, and that a lot of it's about resources. So local authorities, planning departments, properly resourced again, and could support the community. A lot of our ambition is to work with others, and there are people like Acre and Locality and other organisations supporting local communities to help them with having a say in planning. I would agree, then we'd get a better balance. But again, what would you say to someone who's in a flat whom the green belt is the only green space they have access to, and someone wants to build on their bit of green belt? So we're talking lockdown, a lot of people with no green space. So that's a problem as well. Not saying the housing isn't a problem.
Thank you very much. We've got something like 66 questions. I don't think I've ever seen stimulate as much interest, which is a huge compliment to you, Crispin. So
my glass of wine's obviously going to be quite a while.
I know. I'm afraid we can't ask them all. We're trying to see if we can score them on our end credits. So at least you can see. I'm not sure
Jolly, can I suggest we all select one, unless Crispin desperately has to go? I think the people really are interested in these questions. Can we all select one each and ask them?
Yeah, I've got a glass of wine scheduled for 1:30, so as long as we can get to that.
I'm going to jump in and ask you this, Crispin, because it sort of relates to something else that I was thinking about asking you. To what extent are CPRE responses on individual applications signed off by National HQ? And that sort of relates to this point about the structure and the autonomy of the organisation, the CPRE, the umbrella, and then these 41 or whatever it is, local organisations. Can you help on that?
Yes, they're not signed off at all. They are local autonomous charities with their own boards of trustees. But we do work very closely together, and we do have a strategy, which we talked about at the beginning, which we wrote nationally, but very much in consultation with our local groups. And I spent my first 3 months in the job at CPRE going around listening to local CPRE groups. And I got such a sense of desperation, people feeling that the planning system just wasn't defending their interests anymore. So that does feed through into our strategy. We've got the strategy, which is about positive solutions, as we've talked about. And locally, most of our local groups are signed up to it. But, you do get people very angry and upset about proposals that have come out, possibly top down, possibly they weren't involved enough in consultation. You get this adversarial setup, and the local volunteers decide what they oppose and what they don't. Sometimes we agree with them, occasionally we don't, but that's democracy.
Crispin, I'm going to save you.
One last question from you, and then I think just in case our viewers have got family commitments or anything, we probably.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm going to save you, Crispin, from the tender claws of us sitting there all evening asking you questions.
No, I'm very happy.
It's been extraordinarily engaging to have you on, and the fact that everybody wants you to stay on and keep answering questions, real credit and testament to you. And certainly,
no, it's great.
I'll give it.
Let's have Crispin back, because at some stage, because he's
been on the same lines, chaps.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure.
Lovely. I know we've been somebody we've wanted to have on for quite a long time, actually, and we're thrilled that you've picked up the gauntlet, and please do come back. That's all we got for today. Now, next week, we have got somebody who is truly special. Lady Hale, Brenda Hale, the last president of the Supreme Court. I think it's fair to say, with all due respect to Mary, the most successful and inspirational female lawyer in the history of the United Kingdom. Mary obviously comes a close second. She'll be talking about the government's proposed reforms, judicial review, which, if implemented, will be affect planning and environmental casework, as well as a whole raft of other challenges to government action. I'm off to go and try and buy a Spider Brooch T-shirt. We really look forward to welcoming her next week. Thank you again, Crispin. And until then...
And here's St Pancras. Here's St Pancras.
Here we are.
Oh,
You mentioned it earlier, Crispin.
Love it. Saved from the developers.
Cheerio.
From Mary's Harry Potter books.
Thanks again, Crispin. We'll see you all next week. Thanks for signing.
Bye.
Cheers, everybody. Bye-bye.